If you've been in the anime community for at least a season, you should very well know what this anime is. X-Arm has gotten pretty infamous here in recent months, but I feel it's all for the wrong reasons. To get things started, let's go on a bit of a tangent. X-Arm's anime has been talked about by a lot of people, but so few of those people have properly talked about it, and even fewer have actually watched the anime. When you try to look for what people have to say about the series, you'll notice mostly that people only really talk about how it looks, and ignore practically everything else. And that's part of the reason why I wanted to make this video. I'm going to be talking about the series in a way that no one else on AniTube has. Originally, this video was meant to be a very in-depth review of the anime itself. I had planned to read all of the manga that was translated so I could understand how good of an adaptation this anime was, but in doing that I learned that I just could not review the series in the way that I wanted, in good faith. All that reading did was make me biased against the manga. When I first started reading, it was alright. From the start, the adaptation was scene-by-scene accurate, with some really minor differences here and there. Just like the anime, I was enjoying what I was seeing, but unlike the anime, that did not last. I read the equivalent of 2 anime episodes worth of the manga, which is around 15 chapters, and the experience I had between the versions was like night and day. In the anime, there's not many things that I really disliked outside of the protagonist in the early arcs, and some other things I'll talk about later. The thing that made me see X-Arm's manga in such a negative light is mostly how its creator handles the world building, along with various other minor bits of the writing that just doesn't sit well with me. While the first episode of the anime is exactly like the manga, there is a stark difference in writing quality when you start up the second one. The manga chapters that covered this part are probably some of the worst writing I have ever read. It's where the series starts trying to reveal more about the world, but I find that it isn't executed well, so it all comes off as very bloated. For instance, there's a suicide bomber that appears in the early chapters, and the entire flow of the story is slowed down to give you way too much information about this guy that we see for only a few panels. Depending on how it's handled, this could have worked in execution if it was built up over a few chapters, or if it didn't feel as forced because of how important this information was right off the bat. There are many moments in the manga where I feel the writing would have been really great, but it's always undermined by Rock explicitly trying to explain what's currently going on as if the readers are 5 years old. The quality of the writing having a very noticeable drop between chapters 6 and 15 is ultimately what made me stop reading the manga. After that, I just decided to say fuck it and talk about X-Arm's anime on its own, because I found it to be a lot more enjoyable in many different ways. X-Arm's anime gets a lot of flack because of its rough visuals, but it honestly should be commended instead, because it fixes a lot of really small things that adds up to be a major detriment to the series in the long run. The writing bits that made me dislike reading through its manga are not even present in the anime to begin with, so I find it to be an absolute upgrade from the mess that it originated from. After I stopped reading its manga, it felt like a weight was lifted off my shoulders, and I was able to watch the anime in peace. Had I continued reading, it would have affected my enjoyment to the series overall. While the versions have their differences, the overall plot is still mostly the same, so I would have ended up wondering if the writing choices I hated would make it into the anime, or be changed like the few I noticed that weren't there. Honestly, X-Arm isn't even a bad show. It's not a great one by any stretch of the imagination, but it's something that would be greatly enjoyable to watch if you have a few hours to spare. Its plot is pretty simple, being about a boy who believes that he was turned into a weapon, trying to figure out what happened during the years where he has gaps in his memory. It starts off with a lot of promise, so I stuck with it to see where it'd go, and honestly, I wasn't disappointed by it. Even if I didn't like a lot of the source material, I still found myself interested in seeing how our protagonist would develop, when he was the only thing I disliked about the series when starting off. If this anime wasn't done in mostly CGI or had any sort of ties to Crunchyroll, people probably would have forgotten about it before its season even ended. As an anime, I consider it to be a fairly harmless show. I think it's good, but I wouldn't really recommend it to others because you can probably find a similar story that's just done better elsewhere. If this was adapted perfectly from its manga, while there might have been more people actually watching it, I definitely wouldn't have been able to make it past the second episode because, frankly, I feel the only thing that was good about its source material was how it looked. In terms of how the show looks, I don't really care. It's noticeably amateurish in some areas, but I found that the looks of the anime improved a lot as it got closer to its end. The only problems I ever had with the anime was on a technical level, and even then it's mostly just its editing. The anime is edited like it's a live-action series, so it makes things really jarring to see, even if they somehow did everything else perfectly. Overall, the looks can be a bit of a mixed bag at times, but I never saw it as something that ruins the anime. It looks best during the action sequences, but I won't lie and say that they always look great. One particular thing that comes to mind is the ogre fights where, while the action looked fantastic, they were hindered by poor lighting and this really annoying fog overlay. The even worse part is that the fog overlay is used multiple times throughout the anime and downgrades some of the better scenes in the series. The way it's used, you'd think that it'd be hiding something, but it's just there. I've even rewatched several of these scenes and have come to the conclusion that it's just a dumb artistic choice. There's also something that I have to say that no one in the community even watched far enough to notice. While the visuals are rough overall, they do have moments where they're really good, and it just makes you go, I wonder what this would have looked like if they had another year to make it. The models in the anime are really well done and are pretty accurate to the designs in the manga, but the major problem is that they're not given proper lighting and shading throughout the anime, and the animation in some scenes doesn't help all that much either. When it comes to its animation, I generally find a lot of it okay. There are some scenes that are poorly animated, but there's just as many that have good animation to where I find it manages to even itself out along the way. The worst of the animation comes from how little the characters are able to emote. Because of that, some scenes where they're clearly supposed to be showing more intense emotions are really stifled, since their faces don't change much from their neutral positions. That being said, the anime still does have the amateurness of the studio show a lot, and even I can understand to some degree how overbearing some scenes can appear to people that care more about its looks. Like, for instance, every time that a scene shows God's light, it's because the team just did not know how to animate it. These things happen so often that people seriously thought that this show was censored. Past that, the anime has a lot of novelty to it, which adds to my overall enjoyment, especially when you realize how much of it is mocapped. The mocap stuff can definitely be a major distraction for some, but it adds a layer of cheesiness to the anime that makes it really hard for me to dislike. It makes the fighting scenes between humanoid characters really entertaining to watch, but outside of that, it makes some scenes way more awkward than they need to be. I want to mention one more thing before I wrap things up. While I found the writing of the manga to be worse in almost every conceivable form, the character writing was handled a little better compared to some parts of the anime. If you wanted to trudge your way through several painfully written chapters, it's possible that you could get more enjoyment out of it than what I did, but it's not like I left anyone a high bar to surpass or anything. And that was my thoughts on X-Arm. While I wasn't a fan of the series because I felt the plot was weirdly forgettable for its premise, I really liked this anime. It didn't start off the best, and it felt like I wouldn't rate it any more than a 6. But the latter half of the anime really won me over, and I solidified my overall thoughts that this was indeed a good anime. It's really unfortunate that the anime ended up looking so rough though, as this version of the series is superior. If the anime community wasn't so hyper-focused on looks over content, X-Arm's anime might have very well been remembered fondly, but unfortunately, we live in the wrong timeline to see that happen. I hope that those of you who stuck around to the end enjoyed your time seeing probably my most controversial opinion. If you did, why don't you come join my Discord server? We've got plenty of differing opinions on series to go around, so we end up having some interesting discussions here and there, even if they aren't always about anime. Just remember though, if you watch X-Arm, don't stare at Alma's side profile. It's seriously terrifying.